Welcome to this second session on the Divine Plumb Line. The first session covered the area of identity questions, questions about who we are, where we're coming from, and where we're going to, and so forth. In this second session, we're going to talk about the identity crisis. Identity crisis is something that interests many of us because many of us are in and out of identity crises and struggle to formulate what's really going on in our lives in the crisis and even after the crisis is over. A dictionary definition of an identity crisis is this: a personal psychosocial conflict that involves confusion about one's social role and often a loss of continuity to one's personality. Two aspects here: confusion about our social role and a loss of continuity in our personality. Now, I'd like to add a few other things to that definition, but that's the basic dictionary definition of an identity crisis, which is what we want to talk about during this session. And we're first going to look at this whole area of what I call a love deficit and its impact in our lives. You recall in the first session, we talked about this vision that God gave to Amos of a plumb line and a wall that's out of line with a plumb line. I want us to take this picture a little further. And let's suppose for a few moments that you are a little devil. Now, I know you're not, so don't get worried about that, but just think for a few moments that you're a little devil looking over God's shoulder and watching this vision that God was giving to Amos. What would you think as a little devil about that vision? What kind of thoughts and plans would come into your mind? Because sometimes it's helpful for us to get into the way that the devil thinks, because he's an enemy. And the way we learn to out-strategize him is by understanding how he thinks and works. And the scripture encourages us to do that, realizing that he's cunning and wily in his ways. Well, as a little devil, what would you do? Well, one of the things you could do is take a pair of scissors and just cut the line. And what we would have then would be this. In fact, this is symbolic of many people's lives that I interacted with in my practice and also in my work in the University of the Nations. We see people who have no reference points that are of any degree of solidarity or any significance in their lives. And so their lives are just like the enemy just needs to puff and breathe out, and their lives are affected. And another thing that the enemy could do, or you as a little devil could do, and I learned this from my students, by the way, they had all this inspiration as they responded to this question of thinking what a little devil would do with the plumb line, would be just to start pushing it. And just start it moving. And shift its position. Even have it sitting out over here or sitting out over there. And that's what I want us to look at for a little while in this session, how the enemy displaces our plumb line. When we think about the plumb line, we're thinking about the personality and the character of God. That's built into the definition of identity, personality and character. We know that the two words that describe God's character and nature more than any other are love and truth. Love and truth. So, what does the enemy do? He begins to question truth like he did with Eve in the garden. And he displaces truth. He said, did God really say that? Did he really mean that? And he shifted Eve's reference point over here. And he's done that down through the centuries. Shifting the reference points of truth. Even to the point of believing that God doesn't exist. The other way the enemy works to displace our plumb line is through taking love out of our lives. This is what I call the love deficit. You'll see if I let go of the plumb line, it comes right back to the true place. So it requires a force to displace the plumb line, a force of the lie or the force of the love deficit. And I want to particularly talk for a few moments here about the love deficit. I think the lie element is more clear to us, but what is not often so clear to us is what I call the love deficit. Now we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the passage that is really the statement about love. We see here that Paul is highlighting love, as he does in other places in his letters to the churches, over and above everything. He's saying that love is greater than the gifts, greater than the miracles, greater than the works that we can do for God. And in fact, he goes on to say there in 1 Corinthians 13 that without love, we are nothing. Without love, we are nothing. As I pondered and meditated on that statement, I saw something very significant. Let's take a look at this next chart, because what we're doing here is shifting the plumb line over to a false position, either through a lie or through the love deficit, or a combination of both, which is even more powerful. And so what happens is when we take love out of a person's life, they're left with rejection. Love involves acceptance. And acceptance is something that we all search for and we all need and desire. And so when love is removed, we begin to feel less and less accepted until we can come into a place where we are wrestling with thoughts and feelings of rejection. And these thoughts and feelings can begin to influence and affect the way we live in a very significant way. But particularly what I want us to look at is some other things that happen when we take love, or when the enemy takes love out of a person's life. And you'll see in your study guide there that the first equation that I have written is U minus love equals, and you'll see it's a 0 here, because this is basically what Paul is saying. Without love, you are nothing. What I came to see through patience and counselees was this, that the greater the love deficit in a person's life, especially during their early developmental years, the less value they felt they had. Let me say that again, because I think it's very important. The greater the love deficit that we experience in our developmental years, the less value or worth we feel we have in our own lives. And because love is linked up to value. When you love somebody or somebody loves you, you share value, you share worth. And in that way, you also share life. What happens, of course, when love is taken out of a person's life, they can grow up with what we call a detachment or a deprivation syndrome that can result in a neurosis that can influence and affect the personality and lock the personality into immaturity and childish ways of behaving because of the love deficit. We don't realize how powerful love is in our growing up years. It's only when it's not there and we see the effects of it. For example, the tremendous problems that we see in children who are adopted out because there's a love deficit that comes in through the adoption process. It's a breaking of a bonding. And as a result, adopted children usually, not always, but often have a lot of problems in immaturity in the development of their personality. So these deprivation and detachment syndromes link directly to the love deficit. coming into our lives during our developmental years. One of the ways that many young people try to compensate, you see this equation also in your study guide, is by searching for love in the arena of lust. And of course, the enemy has so distorted this word love that it's a synonym to lust. And we use love when we really should be using lust. For example, a young man says to a young woman, "If you love me, you'll go to bed with me." He really should say, "If you lust with me, then you'll go to bed with me tonight." But you see, we don't make that distinction because love is a nicer word. But in fact, that's what we're saying. But what a lot of young people are doing, discovering lust and discovering that this actually brings them into a bigger zero. It takes more value away, if that can be mathematically. When we come to what Paul is saying in this third equation, you plus love, then we can see here that it brings life. It brings joy. It brings peace. It brings a sense of value and worth and so many other things. We could talk a lot about the effects of the love deficit in life, but I just leave you with those few thoughts because love is the most basic and fundamental need of the human heart. And where it is deficit, the human heart and the human personality is affected, sometimes in a very severe and adverse way. But this is the source of a lot of personality disorders, a lot of personality problems, a lot of relationship conflicts go right back here. And we're going to look at this a little further as we go on. But what I want us to see here is that there are those who identify in this whole area of rejection and begin to build their lives up or their personality around that reference point. Others, however, reject rejection. They're a more aggressive, outgoing kind of personality. And so when they reject rejection, they swing right over here to another reference point in rebellion. Now, it may not be overt rebellion, but there is rebellion there. And this reference point becomes another whole guideline in terms of the development of that person's personality. Sometimes you get individuals who swing back and forth from one position to the other, and these are rejection and rebellion people. We call them more passive-aggressive type of personalities because sometimes they can be on the rejection side, which is the passive side. Other times they can swing right over here on the aggressive and the rebellion side. And so that's another category that personalities can fall into. Of course, there are others as well, but these are mainstream reference points that people begin to grow up around and develop their lifestyle through. Now, what I want us to look at next is some of the personality traits that we begin to build up around these reference points. For example, we have a reference point with a plumb line in rejection, as I did in my earlier life. I had a love deficit come in. There was some rejection that I experienced, particularly in the classroom, particularly through a false prophet teacher who humiliated me in front of the class on a number of occasions. It became a pattern in his dealings with me. And as a result of that, I began to feel inferior, and I began to feel rejected by the teacher, and I began to identify with that kind of plumb line. And that affected me for many years of my life and also influenced the development of my personality. What I want us to do is look at some of the personality traits that we can begin to build up and find ourselves wrestling with as we have this kind of reference point. As we experienced rejection and we began to develop thoughts and feelings on this side of the plumb line, what happened was that it sets the stage for the developing of a number of different kinds of personality traits. And the first one I want us to look at here is that of sadness. Now, normally, people go through periods of sadness. In fact, normal life cycle is glad, sad, glad, sad, glad, sad. And circumstances, of course, can change that around. But I've observed that there are people who go on being sad and try to understand why a person can continue in a state of sadness. For example, I was out in Japan doing a seminar out there and met a young woman who was church planting out there, and she had a church that was growing and things were going well, but I noticed there was a sadness in her spirit. So I began to talk to her about this, and what happened was that she had longed to have a husband so she could have a partner out on the mission field and not be out there as a single. But she never had a partner. She never found a man, or God never brought a man to her. And so what happened in her heart was she was grieving over this right, if you like, to have a husband, to help her as a partner in the service of the Lord. And that break of sadness was there in her personality. We talked about it, and she came to the place where through a prayer she released her right to have a husband. She gave that all back to God. I talked about rights, and when we were following Christ, to relinquish rights as he modeled. As she did that, she began to experience joy coming back into her life and began to experience new and fresh life with that joy instead of laboring over it with this break of sadness. So one of the major reasons, I think, is why Christians particularly, and others as well, go on with this break of sadness is because they will not relinquish or give up rights that they feel should be theirs. Of course, this is the spirit of the world. The rights of the mother, the rights of the child, the rights of this one and that one. But Jesus' model is to relinquish his rights. He gave them up. And the only right that he held on to was to do the will of his Father, even to the death of the cross. Another break is that of self-pity. Self-pity is a good friend here to sadness. Self-pity is often comforted instead of being confronted. This kind of person likes to throw parties, self-pity parties. And people go there and heap pity on them, and they feel better. So they need to have parties quite frequently to keep feeling a little bit better about themselves. But self-pity is another brick that comes with this kind of reference point. But self-hatred is a more difficult one. If I were to ask you how you felt about yourself in your times alone with yourself, did you accept yourself, or were the times you rejected yourself? Do you love yourself, or do you hate yourself? It's amazing how many times the response comes back of feelings of rejection and feelings of hatred towards oneself. One of the things that really facilitates this is the love deficit, because if I didn't have the love input in my developmental years, then I don't have the love to pass on to me. In fact, if I had a big love deficit, then I'll have a big love deficit in my relationship with myself as well. In our rehab center, where we are working over in Europe, we have a young lady who from time to time will take a knife and shave skin off herself. And when we talk to her about why she does that, her arms and her face and so on, it's because she hates herself. It's because she can't stand herself. And there's a huge love deficit in her relationship with her mother. And when a crisis comes, it whole heaps back on herself, and then this is what she does. It's a great struggle. But there are Another thing that breeds self-hatred is sexual abuse, particularly among children. And experiences like this turn the child against themselves so that they begin through that lustful and painful crisis in the early developmental stages of their life, start down a road of self-rejection and eventually down into self-hatred. Depression. This is another brick that is a challenge in many lives. There's the complex forms of depression which often need medication to help a person through. They're called endogenous types of depression. The depression I want to talk about more is the reactive kind of depression. That's where there's usually a visible cause or reason. For example, through the loss of a loved one, or through guilt, or something like that. There's a reason why the person should have become sad and to a degree depressed. What most doctors, and what I used to do when a person who came in and was diagnosed with some kind of depression, was quickly write out a prescription called an antidepressant, and within 3 weeks their mood would be feeling better and they would be improving. But what I came to realize later on was that was not really helping my patients. It was helping them to cope, but it wasn't helping them deal with the issue, particularly if it was suppressed guilt, or particularly if it was due to grief over a loss, and that grief had never come up. We had a young man come into our center who was a very successful businessman, but he had to be put off because of depression. When we went back into his childhood, we discovered that when he was 8 years old, his mother died. No one explained anything to him. The last he saw of his mother was in a coffin in a black robe, and no one cried. He didn't cry. He just knew there was a great big hole in his heart, and he had to go on living. So he never grieved. So years later, he's in depression. And so as we began to work with him, began to help him get in touch with that grief, which was the root in behind his depression, and had debilitated him even to the point where he couldn't get up in the morning to do anything, even to do the usual things, and certainly not to get to work. So what I'm saying here is that we need to look and see that there are roots in depression, often in this whole area of the love deficit and the false plumb line of rejection. Apathy is another brick. When you settle down into a life of rejection, it's easy to feel apathetic and to be apathetic about life in general. In fact, one of the great things that pastors wrestle with in the church is apathy in the pews. And I think it's one of the great things that the Holy Spirit works with in the body of Christ as well, to awaken us out of the whole area of apathy. That's what revivals are about, to break down the apathy and bring us back to a new life in Him. Inferiority is another brick that too many Christians wrestle with. It's a heavy brick in my life for many years. I had a strong inferiority complex, which kept me from doing many of the things that normally I would have done. And it keeps the church incapacitated and sometimes paralyzed from doing some of the things God wants to do through it in the world. Insecurity, this is directly relating to a love deficit. You see a child clinging to its parent, particularly out in a public place, not willing to let the parent go out of its sight. It's often because there's deep insecurity coming out of a love deficit in that child's life, and so they are not free to leave the side of their parent, but become very possessive of them through that insecurity. Failure. If I were to ask those of us in the room here, how many of you have failed? I think probably all hands would go up. I would put up a couple of hands. But because we fail, that doesn't make us a failure. But if we have a reference point like this, it can do. We can say, I failed, I'm a failure. And that's what that reference point can do to us and cause us to go into a place of unbelief and hopelessness and other things as well. Guilt. This is another brick that is a very powerful brick, one way or the other. I don't know how you see guilt, but guilt can either be a positive or a negative thing. It just depends on how we respond to it. For example, if I go on wrestling with my guilt and don't face up to it and work with it, eventually it can take me, as I said earlier, into depression. And it can take me into other things as well. And this is what therapists try to do. They try to remove the guilt. This was the great challenge of the whole neo-Freudian movement in therapy, was to try to do something with the guilt that people wrestled with. They recognized that this was a major problem. But what really is guilt? My wife and I were traveling over here and visiting with a friend, and we got into his car, and I didn't put my safety belt on. And so we were sitting there, and a voice spoke up and said, "Fasten your safety belt." And I looked around, and I didn't recognize the voice. And then I realized it was the car talking to me. So then I opened the door a little bit, and then he talked to me again. He said that the rear hand right door is ajar. Please close it. Thank you. And I had a nice little, interesting little conversation, my first one with a car. This was a New Yorker that a friend had, and he was taking us out for a drive in it. And my wife said, in this world where there's so much talk, who would want a talking car? And she couldn't understand why he would. Well, it's the warning systems. I was walking alongside a beautiful big motorcycle. I used to drive motorcycles. And all of a sudden, this motorcycle spoke to me and said, "Get out of my space, get out of my space, get out of my space." And I looked over here, and here was the owner, and he had a little remote control thing controlling the voice. A warning system to a potential thief. That's what guilt is. It's a kind of warning system to prevent us from getting away from the plumb line position of life, and to help us recognize if we continue over in this position, we're going to have to pay the consequences. Get back over here as soon as you can. Take responsibility for the things you need to take responsibility for. And of course, as Christians, we have the most wonderful solution to guilt that the world has ever seen. And we'll talk about that more. So guilt is a very important element here, but it can be detrimental if we don't allow it to do its work in our lives. Now, in these next few breaks, I want us to look more at the spirit element of the personality, and I want us to read from Proverbs chapter 20. Here in verse 27, where it says that the lamp of the Lord searches the spirit of man, and it searches out his inmost being. Another translation says that the spirit of man is the candle of the Lord. What does that mean? Well, I have a candle here that I'd like for us to use as an illustration relating to this scripture here. And what the scripture is saying is that the spirit of man is like this candle, this lighted candle. And of course, the light brings life as well as helps us to see in the darkness. If I were to take a tumbler and put that over the top of the candle like this, just watch the flame and see what begins to happen to the flame. Eventually the flame goes out. Now what's happened here is, of course, is that the flame requires oxygen in order to stay alight with. When I put a tumbler over the top, I restrict the oxygen supply, and eventually when the oxygen is all used up, the flame goes out. I want to suggest that the oxygen is love, and that this tumbler is the plumb line of rejection. It's all the rejections that come into our lives. And the enemy uses those to put over the top of the flame of our spirit and eventually to bring it to a place of going out. Because it needs love. You need love. I need love. He knows that. He was there, the shining one with God the Father in the beginning, and he understands some of these things more than what we realize. These bricks all relate to this dynamic of what the power, the influence and the power of rejection over our lives and their development. So let's take a look at the effects here. We see the candle, first of all, going into a phase of dimness as the oxygen supply begins to become less. And that's when we're wrestling with rejections of one kind or another, whether they be words or experiences or the loss of a significant person in our lives, whatever it be. And then the flame begins to die. And we can become in a place of more and more distress over this. And eventually, of course, that flame gets quenched. And when it's quenched, we really get into a place not only of discouragement, but also of despair. So basically what we see here is a master strategy of the enemy through this whole area of rejection to quench our life. Let me just briefly give you an illustration here in relationship to that. And that's of an elder who was in a church. He was a very well-accepted, well-known teacher in his area. And one of the things that was not known was that he was also a practicing homosexual. And one day this came out to the light and was exposed, and he was a broken man. In fact, the rejection that he began to wrestle with took him not only right down through dimness and dying, but down into the point of quench, to the point where he wanted to commit his suicide. And several of us worked with him, counseled with him, prayed with him. For a number of weeks, he was right on the edge. And then one day, God came by his Spirit and began to minister to him in a very powerful way. Otherwise, for sure, he would have taken his life. No one would have been able to stop him. But now he's back in ministry and totally restored, and he's never gone back into that lifestyle again. It's a miracle of the grace of God. But I share this to illustrate how this all works. But let's swing now over to the other side to see what happens when we have a reference point in the area of rebellion, when we have a more aggressive position in life. Usually on this side, we struggle a little bit around leadership. If you feel uneasy around leadership, it's often because you have some reference points back over in this side. And the first brick I want us to look at is hostility. I was teaching a class in one of our counseling schools talking about the importance of emotions and understanding the language of our emotions. And one of the women students came up in the break and said, I'm having a difficulty to understand what's going on, the strong emotion that's coming up during this last session. So I said to her, well, tell me about this emotion so we can look at it and try to understand what it's communicating to you. Because I'd been saying that emotional illness is often a result of not understanding the language of our emotions and responding to them appropriately. So this is what she said. During this last session, I feel a lot of anger coming up, and I wanted to come out to the front and clench my fist and punch you right in the nose with all my might. I took a step back, being not wanting to have my nose crushed in. And I said, well, that's interesting. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for not doing it. Now, let's talk about this anger. And basically what was going on was she had suffered some deep wounding through rejection from her dad. And she had swung over into rebellion against him. And God was surfacing this deep pain and wound. And in front of that came the anger and the hostility. That was the message of her anger, was that there was a wound down there that needed to be healed. And God began that healing right there in the class at that time. Conceit and sophistication are two things that keep us from building wholesome and close relationships, because they keep us at a distance from each other. And the reason most often is because there's a reminder of someone who hurt or wounded us, and we project that on to the person in front of us, and we decide, well, I don't like him. Yes, I like him because he reminds me of this person in my past that I had a good relationship with. Conceit and sophistication are rampant in relationships, and too much so in the church. And this is where we can get cliques and divisions, and the unity is prevented. Elation and deflation are two other bricks relating to mood. Sometimes we see a person swinging in the way they experience their mood. One time they're way up here and they're very excitable and they just going 20 to the dozen. Another time they're flat and quiet and withdrawn. And this kind of swing of mood is indicating a high level of stress inside. And unless the person gets help to deal with some of the inner issues, they can head on into a breakdown of one kind or another. So the mood swing is another indicator of a lot of conflict and turmoil going on, as can be seen in a person who has a rebellion as a reference point in their lives. Superior. None of us like being around a person who acts out and speaks in a superior way. But the reason a person does this is to cover up inferiority. And when we recognize that, it helps us to reach out to help that person with their problem. Being competitive. Now, there is a healthy kind of competition, but what I'm talking about here is the unhealthy form, where a person is driven by competition. They have to win, or they have to be near the top. And of course, this is something that is brought into the life of a child when a parent dispenses love on the basis of performance. If they do well at school, have a good report card, they do well in their sport, or whatever area, then they're loved. If not, love is held back and even withdrawn. So the child learns to relate performance to love. That means their life becomes performance-driven. They have to compete with whoever's out there, or they don't get love. And that's a trap that many have fallen into in this performance-orientated society. One day God was speaking to me about my sons and trying to prevent them from falling into that trap. They were doing nothing, just playing on the floor here, and I went down to one of them and put my arm around him. His name is Lionel. And I said, Lionel, I just want to tell you that Daddy loves you, and you're special and precious to him. And he looked up at me with a big grin in his face. He said, I love you too, Daddy. And then just carried on playing on the floor. And God showed me something, that He wanted me to love my children for who they were, irregardless of what they did. That's how He loved me. And I believe there's an important point here in this whole area of parenting. Dominant. Out of insecurity, we move into a place of being dominant in relationships. And then we begin to alienate. Being rigid. Having too much identity and structure, so that when structures are not there or change, we feel very insecure. Manipulation is another brick. We'll talk a little bit more about this brick because it's a very common one and it's very disruptive of relationships at every level. Being stubborn. Stubbornness relates to this whole area of having to be right. How easy is it for you to say to a friend or your spouse, sorry, I was wrong? For me, it's not easy at times. And it's because I realize I have too much identity in having to be right. But who of us is right 100% of the time? So this brick can also be a difficult one in relationships. Being unteachable. This is where I have too much identity in my knowledge. So if my doctrine is challenged and someone disproves it, I have an identity crisis. That incidentally has been part of the history of the church because it's had too much identity in its doctrine. Jesus didn't say what can separate us from the doctrines of theology. He said what can separate us from the love of God. It's love where we find our value, and it's love where we need to return to discover our true identity. Delusion. When we go on in deception, we come to a place of a delusion, and this is where we really are totally convinced of the truth of a lie. And this can be very devastating. Some things that affect our spirit here. Bitterness and resentment. If we fail to forgive, if we choose not to forgive, basically what we choose is resentment and bitterness. And this is demonstrated in the feud that's gone on for years in Ireland, things that are going on in Bosnia right now over Kosovo and the situation there. There's a bitter root because forgiveness has not been implemented. Responsibility has not been taken up in that way. And until it is, it'll be difficult to resolve the crisis. Being critical. We'll talk more about this. Being controlling in relationships. And possessing another's life. All of these bricks or traits can emerge with this kind of reference point where we discover that we continually struggle in building healthy relationships because of a false plumb line, because of a false reference point. And so what we see here as we put all this together is a wall of rejection and a wall of rebellion. Both of these walls are out of line with God's plumb line. And if we continue living with a reference point in rejection, ultimately it could take us to the end point of wanting to take our lives. I live in Switzerland, and the suicide rate for young people in a certain age bracket is very high there. Why? Because I believe there's a huge love deficit in family life. Switzerland has everything, beauty, wealth, and all these other things. But the area where it has a great deficit is in knowing and understanding and passing on love from one generation to another. So the suicide rate surfaces this element. The reference point in rebellion, then instead of taking our own lives, we get to the place where we move to take someone else's life. And that's how homicide happens. So you see, when we have a reference point that's passive in rejection, or one that's aggressive in rebellion, the end result either way is death. In fact, this is what Paul is talking about in Romans, where he says, "Who shall deliver me from this body of death?" And so what I'm demonstrating here, just by us meditating on this vision God gave to Amos and then developed through Ezekiel and others, is what Paul talks about. When we try to build our lives up with a reference point other than God's reference points, then what happens is we're moving away from life. We're moving away from the inheritance that God has for us. These are called in the world alternative lifestyles. I want to suggest that there are alternative death styles and that there are no alternative lifestyles. There is a lifestyle that is symbolized here in the plumb line. And this is a place that God calls us to live. And the closer we live to it, the greater our inheritance, the more fulfillment, the more significance, the more value and worth we feel as we live according to God's ways. Now, there are some questions that you can look at in these sessions, and I want us just to want to encourage you to take some time out just to meditate on the questions in relationship to your identity, and particularly this session on identity crisis. So I'd encourage you to look through these bricks and see where you have experienced a brick in your own life. Maybe you're still wrestling with one or other or more of these bricks. In one of our sessions, a man put up his hand in his 60s, very successful businessman, and he said, "What happens if you've got all of the bricks?" Well, God met with that man in a very powerful way during that seminar, and his walls just came crumbling down, and he began a whole new life in relationship with God, with himself, and began to work on his family relationships, which had been devastating as well. So think about what we're talking here and take some time out to process in your own heart and life with God, and we'll come back to talk more about this whole area of identity as it relates to Christianity.